So I did get the chance to listen to the last two speakers, the last 2 weeks, and was actually greatly edified by that. But there's part of me that thinks, race and ethnicity and nationalism and immigration and, it's so complicated. And there's part of me that thinks, there's got to be a way to simplify this. And so as I've been thinking about it, I thought, let's just do away with everything that we've ever thought about in terms of all of that stuff. And instead, let's just realize there's two kinds of people in the world, right? Two kinds of people. There are people who recognize that you're born sinful, and there are people who've never hung out with 2-year-olds. Right? Because anybody who's hung out with a 2-year-old knows you're born sinful and can pretty much describe it, right? It looks like 3 basic phrases. It looks like no in response to anybody who's in authority. It looks like mine in response to any shiny object that they happen to want or keep. And it looks like not fair in response to any time they think they're not getting their way. Right? No, mine, and not fair. So I'm a middle-aged, white, American male. In this room, I'll self-identify as an evangelical, although I think that term is losing its relevance. And so some of you who are going into more academic fields, maybe you can give us a really good next term for that. Like, how do we talk about that? But because of that, I have certain perspectives, having been born and raised in this country, mostly in the Midwest as a white male. And I recognize that I bring that to the table. Part of that understanding of that and how I feel and how many Americans feel about issues of immigration, it doesn't happen in a bubble, right? It happens in a context, and it happens in a historical context. And so it's helpful to think about that historical context. So I learned in grammar school that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? And he came and discovered America. And what I didn't learn, but I now know, is that most European Christians at that time believed in what was called divine right. And divine right stated that the king was divinely chosen by God and had the right to rule, and no human could gainsay the king. And as part of that divine right, they developed something called the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery basically stated that if a Western Christian, European Christian discovered a land that was inhabited by anyone other than other European Christians, hadn't already been claimed by European Christians, they could go in and claim that land as their own for their king. So that's essentially what Columbus did, is he came in, found this land, he thought it was India, and named the people Indians, and there's been confusion ever since, and claimed the land for his king and queen. Right? The doctrine of discovery. A little over 300 years later, America is starting to come into its own and is forming itself. And we read these words written by John Marshall, who was a Supreme Court justice. So this is a legal case that he was ruling on in the early 1800s. And he says this: "The character and religion of the New World's inhabitants," so North Americans, inhabitants, "afforded a reason for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. Excuse, if not justification, could be found in the character and habits of the people whose rights had been wrested from them. The potentates of the old world, Europe, made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing upon them civilization and Christianity. So that was the legal ruling of the Supreme Court for what the U.S. government was basically doing to Native Americans. 300 years after Columbus, not a lot had changed. It's interesting to me to think about the three statements of two-year-olds: no, mine, not fair. And to think about the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, we basically said no to the King of England. No, you can't do that. You can't rule over us. Mine, this land is mine. We live here, not you. And not fair. No taxation without representation. Right? And we revolted and we formed our own country. Now, I'm not here to say that the American Revolution was sin, but when we start to see a pattern of behavior over hundreds of years, we begin to see a certain ethos that's passed on from generation to generation and is expected by those who come in to be part of that group. As I read these words from John Marshall from 23 maybe, a few tweaks and changes to those words, and it could be a modern day politician speaking on refugee issues or immigration issues. So deep in the American psyche is this idea of no, mine, not fair. And when we begin to talk about immigration, that's the place that we naturally come from. You know, there are good things about those three statements, right? They can be great in the cause of injustice, in terms of fighting injustice. No, you know, mine, that's my family. You keep your hands off. You're not going to hurt them. You know, it's not fair. No, you aren't going to do this to hurt people I love. Right? So there's a way to use those words for good. But there's also, like anything good brought to the extreme, a way that they can be used for evil. And I think we need to be very careful in how we see kind of the log in our own eye. But as Christians, the immigration debate, the immigration question, I think is a great opportunity. Because the questions that are asked around immigration are most often questions of economic value, safety and security, politics. What's in it for me as a native-born American? It's almost never questions about the bigger picture. What's in it for the human race? What's in it for my fellow humans also created in the image of God? What's in it for us all together? And so as Christians, I think we bring something else to the narrative. And what we bring is at least three different statements. The first is this: there's a king worth saying yes to. There's a king worth saying yes to. So Colossians 1:15, and Colossians 1:15 to the end is really, if you read that through the immigration debate lenses, it is phenomenal. And I'd love to exegete that with you for the next 7 hours, but we won't. Some of you have classes to get to. But 1:15 starts out, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. There's a king who's worth saying yes to. Why? Because he's all-powerful and he's all good. He's all-powerful and he's all good. In fact, he's so all good that he knows what it's like to suffer. He came, took on humanity. Now think about this in terms of entitlement, right? If anyone was entitled, wasn't it the Son of God? Think about Philippians 2, right? We should have the same attitude as Christ Jesus. Even though, he's equal, he didn't consider equality God something to be grasped, to be held on to. He gave it up. He gave up that which he was entitled to come and suffer. And not just death on a cross, although ultimately that, but he came and suffered as a refugee fleeing to Egypt. He came into a land that he knew he was going to be persecuted by his own people. And so he knows what it means to suffer, to be persecuted, to be scandalized. But he also knows what it means to face what many natural-born Americans fear in the immigration discussion. And that is, we fear losing our country. Someone I knew growing up, honestly believed that the Hispanic immigrants that were coming into the United States in the 70s were tools being used by Cuba to ensure that we would all become communists. They honestly believed that. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that view, starting with, the Latino culture is not homogenous at all. Least of all when you are talking about Cuba and other Latin countries, right? So it's ridiculous. But this person was a learned person who had a master's degree and was a solid Christian, and that was their honest belief. There's a fear that we're going to lose our country. Jesus lived in that, right? They had lost their country. The Romans ruled their country. Now, they had some autonomy and some freedoms and stuff, but ultimately they weren't in charge. The Romans were in charge. So he knows what it's like to live in what some of us are afraid will happen if we let in a bunch of people who don't look like us, don't sound like us, don't eat like us, don't listen to our music, right? So if we're afraid of that, here's a king who knows what that's all about. He's a king worthy of saying yes to, because he's all powerful and he's all good, and he gets it. He gets it from the standpoint of the suffering. He gets it from the standpoint of those who are worried about what might happen. Number two, the king owns the land. Who owns this land that we're on right now? You may not know this, but this is not Deerfield, Illinois. I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but yeah, this is actually Bannockburn, Illinois. It's a well-kept secret. Sorry, Internet. But Bannockburn doesn't like the attention, and so they call this Deerfield. But who owns this piece of property? My guess is somewhere on campus there's a piece of paper, a deed that says this piece of property belongs to whatever it's being called these days, Trinity International University, probably. Or to the skull and bones, mysterious people who, behind the scenes pull all the strings on this institution to make sure that it follows exactly the political whatever if you're a conspiracy theorist, right? So it's owned by Trinity. Except I think there are probably people who would say the people who sold it to Trinity bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody. And if you go back far enough, it was actually stolen from the Michigamia tribe who had lived on it for however many hundreds of years before the white people came. I don't know legally what that means, or if we even have any way of thinking about that. Who owns it? Well, as believers, ultimately we believe the king owns it, right? It belongs to God. And he owns it because he created it. And in the fact that he's the creator, he has first rights. And I think we've done a disservice to the early verses of Genesis that say we're to have dominion over the land. That's not signing over the deed. As God makes very clear to the Israelites when he leads them into the promised land, and he says this, the land must not be sold permanently. This is Leviticus 5:23. Because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. The land belongs to God. The king owns the land. Now, he's a trustworthy king. We already said he's all powerful and he's all good. And that tells us something, because this emphasis on mine is an emphasis that comes out of fear of losing something. How can you lose what you don't already have? And if it's not yours to lose, there's a certain freedom in holding that openly. There's a certain freedom emotionally. So my wife and I have lived in the Chicago area for many years, and being so close to Lake Michigan, I've often thought about how great it would be to own a boat. Until I started really thinking about what do boat owners have to do, right? You got to clean your boat, take it out of the water every fall, put it back in every spring, pay for this, pay for that. So what I decided is I don't want to own a boat. I want to have a really good friend who owns a boat. Right? Let them do all the work, I get all the fun. Well, in a sense, that's what we get with the king, right? He owns the land. It's his ultimate responsibility. All we have to do is be faithful. All we have to do is steward it well. And stewarding it well is a whole other topic that I really wanted to get into because there's lots of confusion about that. Let me just say, stewarding well does not mean buying into the cultural ROI. Okay? So if you have questions about that, I'd love to get into that, but won't right now. So there's a lot of freedom there. There's a lot of freedom in saying it's the king's land. And how do we respond if it's the king's land? And there's a lot of things in this book that help us understand how to steward it for the king. Because he has told us certain things that he wants to happen when he's around. So the king owns the land. And thirdly, the king digs breaking down walls. The king digs breaking down walls. I was born as a jazz musician. That's what I did my undergraduate work in. So I can use the word dig. It puts people on their toes. What? What was that word? But the king digs that. Think about Joshua and Jericho. Think about when Jesus died, what happened to the curtain in the temple. Think about Ephesians 2. Go back and reread Ephesians 2, where Paul talks about the dividing wall of hostility and what God did in Christ and breaking that down. And read it through a succession of lenses. Theological lens, the wall of hostility between humans and God, between Jew and Gentile, between races, it's fascinating. The king loves to demolish walls. In fact, the king has said that I'm reconciling the world to myself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And I'm committing to you this message of reconciliation. So how should we think about immigration? About who belongs, in light of the fact that the king, who owns the land, who is worthy of saying yes to, loves to demolish walls. I think, first of all, it changes the nature of the conversation because it's no longer about me and what I want. Right? It's about the king and what he wants. And I no longer have to have the same kind of concerns about safety, my own, my family's, my country, my future, economics, politics, the way America will look 50 years ago if we keep letting in all of these foreigners, right? All those questions are still valid questions, but they're much further down the priority list. Because the important questions are, what about the king? What about the king? What about Jesus? And so I think the immigration conversation is a narrative that the church can step into and begin to have conversations with people who don't care one whit about Jesus, but can bring him into the conversation in a way that they see that he's totally relevant to what's going on right now. Because the king not only cares about the immigrant coming, the king cares about the people who are now in the land. And the fear and the uptightness and the control, the desire to control, and everything else that leads to no, mine, no fair, No, you may not come in. The land is mine. No fair. We're going to raise tariffs. We're going to, raise trade deficits, whatever. All of the angst that puts that into play is eased by Jesus. When I will submit to Jesus and allow him to be who he wants to be in my life, those things take on secondary relevance, and suddenly the all-powerful God, who is also all good, has taken personal responsibility in my life over those things I'm most concerned about. And so the way I make decisions is profoundly different. So whether we're talking about immigration or tax reform or poverty or refugee numbers or whatever it is, this same kind of American ethos shines through, right? Independence, control, it's mine, justice, and it's a real opportunity. Because even though we may not like the way those things are being expressed, and sometimes I don't like the way I express those things, what it shows is a need that Christ can fill. And that's a conversation that we can have with people. That ends up being much bigger than the immigration conversation, although the immigration conversation is directly influenced by it.